This is Dr. Rob Harder with the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast, Making Your World Better. What does it take to be an effective nonprofit leader today? What are the biggest challenges? What are the biggest obstacles? How should nonprofits fundraise in an economy that is constantly changing? All of these reasons combined led me to start this show. And it's my hope that through this series, people can learn not only what it takes to be an effective nonprofit organization, but to hear from effective leaders who are successfully making a positive impact in their communities. We hope you enjoy the show as together we hear how they are making their world better. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. So good to have you here, whether you're tuning in and driving into work or you're listening as you work out. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for being part of this community. In fact, I love it when I hear from all of you, or some people have posted on LinkedIn, for example, or on social media about a particular episode and what it meant to you, the insights you gained. Love that. Keep that going just because it's encouraging to me, and it's super encouraging also to the guests that we featured in that particular episode. And it just helps the word get out about these great conversations we're having with really top leaders and thinkers in the nonprofit field. So today is no different. Now, if you've been a listener for a while, you know I've had several guests from Bridgespan on the show here, and it's mainly because I've been really impressed with their work. I feel like Bridgespan does a lot with research and data collection that really help us as nonprofit leaders lead better. And so if you're not familiar with Bridgespan, or this is the first time you've heard about them, in short, they're dedicated to both advising and collaborating with social change leaders, including philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, and impact investors. So they do a lot of different things. But again, what I found most valuable is some of the research papers they do, and again, the data collection on things that directly impact the nonprofit sector. And today's guest, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about everything from, what are the leadership trends in philanthropy? What are ways to better recruit and retain your staff as nonprofit leaders? That and many other things we discuss. And my two guests today are Christian Celeste Tate and Anum Qadir. They are the new podcast co-hosts for Dreaming in Color. This is Bridgespan's own podcast, and they'll talk about that and some of the guests they've had on the show. It's pretty fascinating. So thanks again, and as always, for tuning in. Now on to the show. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business. Well, welcome to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. So glad to have Christian and Anum on the show from Bridgespan. Welcome.
Thank you, Rob. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, this is exciting. So maybe we can start by you can share your new roles, and then we're going to dive into all kinds of things about leadership, about trends in the nonprofit sector. Because Bridgespan, if you've been a listener for a while to my podcast, we have had at least two guests, maybe up to three now from Bridgespan. And you may be saying, I'm not paid by them. Don't worry, this is not a sponsorship, but it's just they have so much good data. They do a lot of research, and I found them so helpful personally. I felt like, wow, I'd love to continue to have them on the podcast because they do have a lot of good resources. And I don't think today will be any different. But quickly, for those who maybe not be aware, Anum and Christian, you have some new roles. So maybe just briefly talk about that, talk about what your role is and what led you to get into this new role.
Yeah, I'm excited to share that Christian and I are guest hosts on a podcast called Dreaming in Color, which Bridgespan produces along with Studio Pod, and really to help better understand how the lived experiences, particularly for leaders of color, have shaped their paths in the work that they do today. But I'll let Christian also share a bit more.
Yeah, the podcast has been around since 2022. It's hosted by Darren Isom. And for season 3, Darren passed the mic off to me and Anum to showcase some younger perspectives on leadership and younger voices of color. So it was a unique opportunity, and excited to chat with you more about it.
Yeah, we had Darren on the show. I think he was the last guest, and it was so fun to hear how that got launched. And already you've gotten some great response, I know, from that. So that's excellent. So, okay, let's dive into, as I mentioned from the beginning, Bridgespan really is dedicated to both advising and collaborating with social change leaders, philanthropists, nonprofit and NGO leaders, and impact investors. So you've kind of got a nice wide swath, but it's all for the idea of how can we do more good in the world. I thought it would be really important for my listeners today, just talk a bit about the trends you're seeing. So maybe talk about specifically with the nonprofit sector and philanthropy as a whole. Are there some changes that you're seeing already, or that are soon coming around the corner when it comes to the financial side of nonprofits and the philanthropy side, the fundraising side? What are you seeing right now as some common trends? And maybe Christian, you could kick this off, and then Anum.
Yeah, so I guess first I would caveat that I can share sort of what I've observed from my work at Bridgespan, although this is certainly not the Bridgespan take per se. One thing that I would note is that I think we've spent a lot of time reflecting on the impact of the pandemic, both from a fundraising perspective, from a day-to-day perspective, from an execution perspective. But I think we've spent a little bit less time reflecting on the whole civil rights movement that occurred during that same time period. And I think that has had enormous implications, not just on where money is moving and how it's flowing, but also in terms of the expectations that folks have from the organizations that they work for, that they associate with, that they benefit from. And so I think that there's a lot that has been unpacked there, and certainly a lot more that is that folks are still coming to understand.
Well said. Okay, Anum, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I'd follow a similar theme building off of just the civil rights movement. I think both externally for how organizations are trying to navigate the impact they're trying to have, as well as some of the internal dynamics. Just as a caveat, my work has primarily been focused on national and community-based nonprofits. And I've been doing a lot of work, especially on racial equity and helping folks develop racial equity plans. One of the big things that's come up with that is the external environment, especially the dynamic political movement that we're in. And then even my conversations with CEOs this past year have changed from, say, a year ago. A year ago, it was more focused on, how can we really commit to diversifying our teams? How do we really address racial equity in our programs and the impact we're trying to have? Over the past 6 months, especially now, it's been more conversations on how do we navigate some of these kind of more antagonistic forces or a lot of the anti-rights movement pieces that are showing up, everything from what can we say or not say to how do we even think about recruitment. And obviously we are not legal experts on how to navigate a lot of those pieces, but I do think are real in terms of how organizations are trying to stay committed to the impact that they're trying to have. On the internal side, I think a lot of folks have been seeing, or a lot of the organizations I've had a chance to work with are also seeing internal dynamics as leaders, especially with, challenges to power. Staff are feeling burned by leadership and there's more debate about decisions, et cetera. Dax Devlin Ross from Third Settlements had a piece on this in Nonprofit Quarterly, but really it helped acknowledge some of those pieces are actually just driven by other matters, whether it's clarity or accountability and transparency. And I thought he had some really helpful pieces of actually not shying away from those tensions, especially internally, rather leaning into those. Because one, at the very least, you'll get to some more communication and transparency with staff. They can better understand trade-offs that leaders are experiencing as they're making these decisions. And at best, you actually get to better answers, right? If you're actually understanding what are staff experiencing, what are they bringing, and how can we get to better decisions and answers for our organizations.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And we're going to dive a little bit more into that, particularly when we're talking about dreaming in color and the podcast and some of the involvement you've done there. Let's stay on that theme for a little bit more about philanthropy and fundraising. I've had other guests on the show to talk about there is certainly a clear national trend, sadly, that giving to charity is going down. There was a brief spike during COVID, right? People really got excited and wanted to do something, whether it be with social justice issues or humanitarian aid or even medical support because of the COVID pandemic and different things like that. But it's gone back down to, sadly, negative trends going downward again across the board. Now, there's always anomalies, and there's certain organizations that are doing well. And Mackenzie Scott is doing her best just by herself, trying to give nice, big gifts to certain individual organizations, which is wonderful. But in general, that is the case right now. So what would you recommend for nonprofit leaders? What are the trends you're seeing, and what are some of the recommendations? What should nonprofit leaders do to adjust to the new reality, if you will, that perhaps people are just not giving as much, or perhaps they just don't have as much to give because everything else is costing so much more. They just don't have as much to give as they used to. Maybe, Anum, you could start with this one and then Christian.
Yeah, I'd say two things come to mind. One is just recognizing and getting clear on, as an organization, what are your most important priorities, and really what is going to drive your theory of change and intended impact. I think especially given how the environment continues to change, both whether it's a funding piece or the external environment continues to change in this political moment, taking a look at those, I think, will just really help figure out what is the highest and best use of your scarce resources, and sometimes even more scarce resources these days. And then the second piece I'll name actually comes from one of the guests that we had on the podcast, Rebecca Dixon from the National Employment Law Project. One thing she had noted was just the value of investing internally and this notion that how you do the work matters just as much as the work that you're doing. So whether it's strengthening your decision-making processes or investing in your staff, I have multiple clients right now who are going through, they're tightening their belts. And that's been a part of the conversation is, yes, we want to make sure we're focused on the impact, but how do we also not let that create trade-offs for the kind of organization we still need to be internally as well?
Okay. No, that's helpful. Yeah, Christian, what would you add to that?
So I think first, in terms of the trend itself, I think that what you're describing is real. And I would encourage folks not to get lost in the abstraction of it, right? Because although on the whole, this may be the trend that we're seeing, there's so much more nuance that's not captured by that headline, right? And there's nuances within different parts of the sector in terms of who's receiving funding and how that funding is being moved. And so I would encourage folks to look more closely at the individual context that they find their organization in to try and find more actionable trends within that broader landscape that can be more informative. Then another thing I would say, and I think this builds pretty directly on what Anum shared, is just the importance of constantly reevaluating your theory of change, right? Because although these may be the trends in funding, even if funding is going down, right, the need is not. And so there's still an overwhelming amount of need for nonprofit organizations and the work that they do. And so the disconnect oftentimes lies within that theory of change and having a really clear North Star that is guiding you, from which all of the programming, all of the marketing, all of the work that you're doing stems from.
That's a well put word. The theory of change is so important, isn't it? How we view that, how do we deal with that? Does your organization have a clear theory of change in response to all that's happening? So I think that's a really good point. I want to get back to that. Another issue, and this really is a good segue into that. I keep hearing this from nonprofit leaders across the board that they're struggling with, on the one hand, recruiting people to their nonprofit, and number two, retention, keeping people. There's all kinds of reasons. It's sometimes nonprofit salaries can't be at the same level as for-profit or other opportunities in civic roles, maybe school districts and things like that. Sometimes they're burnt out. It's just so much work and so much need, as you mentioned, Christian, that they just get worn out in the job. The compassion fatigue is real. But anything you could speak to that when it comes to recruitment and retention? What have you seen has worked? What do you recommend? What are some of those trends you're seeing for nonprofits specifically? They're really doing a good job, it seems like, from the outside anyway, of recruiting new people and keeping their people and taking care of them. Anum, could you start with this one and tell us what you've seen so far?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. One is, I think especially with the civil rights movement in 2020, et cetera, there was a lot of focus on recruiting and diversifying. Like, we absolutely need more diversity in leadership. We absolutely need more diversity across the organization. And oftentimes what I think does get overlooked in that is actually, how are you also internally setting the table for a place that people want to be? And that, I think, also gets to the retention piece. But I think, at least my observation of a handful of organizations I've worked with recently, they focus much more on the recruiting piece and without thinking about the retention, and oftentimes actually thinking about, like, what is the internal organization you want to create that people want to stay in, oftentimes needs to come first.
Well said. Okay. Christian, what do you think on that? What's your experience been so far?
Yeah. So, first I would validate the trend that you're seeing, right? I think it's pretty undeniable that that's something that folks are struggling with across the sector. And unfortunately, there's no silver bullet to it, right? It's challenging to work with limited resources and make that happen. One thing I will say, though, is sort of a corresponding trend that I have observed, which is in the prioritization of self-care. I've seen a lot of a pretty big increase in organizations experimenting with things like sabbaticals and flexible time off, benefits that do have a price tag for the organization, but that can encourage staff to prioritize themselves holistically in order to try and find sustainability. Because I think, unfortunately, we need to acknowledge that the work is hard, right? Like you said, folks across the board feel underpaid. The work can feel never ending depending on what type of work you're in, but it's also really important. And so I think, to the extent that we can encourage folks to find sustainability through balance while also grounding them in the importance of the work that they're doing, I think that's critical.
I feel like I'd be remiss if I also didn't channel one of our colleagues, Preeta, who I think was on the podcast before
She
too.
was. That's right. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a real tension of, we only have so many resources. Folks would like to be able to provide these kinds of benefits and things like that. And her and one of our other former colleagues, Kurt Kramer, put together a piece on how do you actually invest in leadership development and recognizing even some of those like non-financial pieces that actually help people in their careers, but also hopefully feel more interested in staying as well. Anyway, so I'll put a plug in for that work as well.
No, I'm so glad. Yeah, Preeta was great to have on the show. And yeah, I think there is some non-monetary benefits that you can provide your staff, absolutely, that can make a huge difference. But you really need to spell that out, be intentional. I think one of the biggest things that I think I've seen effective nonprofits do is really create a culture where people want to be part of the culture, because that's something more and more, as I've seen studies done on this, that particularly this next generation that's coming up, they actually want just as much as a good paycheck, they want a good culture to work within. So if you have the culture that they want and it's a mission-driven culture, and yeah, maybe they can make a little bit more working over here at this company, but the culture is not the same, you maybe be able to keep them, but you have to be intentional with creating that culture that you want. And so, okay, resiliency, that's such a critical key for leadership as well. And I think when you do have these challenges that we're facing, it becomes even more important to not just lead with resiliency, but help foster resiliency within your staff and within your team in a nonprofit organization. So what do you think about that when it comes to leadership? How do good leaders develop resiliency, not just for themselves, but for their team? And Christian, maybe you could start with this one.
I mean, I think you just said it, Rob. I think it goes back to creating that culture. I think creating culture is not about the way you describe your organization on the website, right? I think creating culture is about the way you demonstrate the norms of your organization as a leader. And I think that when we talk about resiliency, I don't think there's a grand distinction between staff and leadership. I think that, this is one thing Rebecca Dixon talked a lot about on her episode of Dreaming in Color, is the importance of establishing your norms and then living them so that your team can see you exercise balance. And then that becomes the culture of your organization. And I think that's a really powerful and effective.
I love that. That's really good. Yeah, Anum, what would you say to this?
Yeah, one of the other things that our guest, Arlen Hamilton from Backstage Capital, noted in an episode of Dreaming in Color was just even taking notes and celebrating your successes, both big and small, both for the purposes of like, okay, cool, I'm like accomplishing things, driving some of that sense of fulfillment, but also just recognizing where sometimes that also has an effect on others as well as your role modeling. And I know that's particularly important as people of color, being able to see someone else that looks like you that's doing successful things, big or small. And then I think also sometimes just being open and honest about some of the failures too. I think there's actually a lot of growth that comes within that. Another guest on the podcast, Michael Tubbs, the former mayor of Stockton, he's known for all the great work that he's done on guaranteed income, et cetera. But he had also talked about was when he lost his reelection campaign, and there actually being a lot of clarity in that and recognizing like, what are you willing to fail for? There's some of those pieces that also, can drive resiliency and to be committed to kind of that bigger North Star, even if it's a bumpy road to getting to it.
That's an interesting comment, isn't it? What are you willing to fail for? That's a really good question, because I think nonprofits, in many ways, their whole mission, they're willing to do that, right? That they're going to go for broke to make sure they meet a need, even if that means that they, go to the very end of the life of that organization. We'll be right back. Are you looking for an easy and effective way to boost your nonprofit's donations? Look no further than DonorBox, the online fundraising platform that streamlines your fundraising efforts, maximizes donations, and simplifies giving for your supporters. With DonorBox, you can create beautiful donation forms, accept digital wallet payments, track donations, and send auto receipts. And the best part? There are no setup or monthly fees and no long-term contracts required. So what are you waiting for? Visit donorbox.org today to get started. That is donorbox.org. Are you ready to revolutionize your advocacy efforts and significantly impact policy change? Discover Quorum and level up your advocacy to influence more lawmakers. Quorum is the only unified public affairs platform that empowers nonprofits to map, track, change, and report on the policy landscape, all in one place. Explore how Quorum Grassroots helps nonprofits create compelling campaigns in minutes. The result? Your nonprofit doesn't just participate in the advocacy, it drives it. Quorum, where influence meets innovation. You can learn more at quorum.us. Hey friends, and thanks so much for listening to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. I want to let you know that I've recently become a professional certified coach. With my nearly 30 years of nonprofit experience, I know firsthand how hard you work as a leader. I also know how important it is to have someone you can call on to get help with the barriers, the leadership challenges that you will face both professionally and personally. And I really want people to thrive, to become all they were meant to become by providing coaching and consulting services. So if coaching is something you've always been interested in, but maybe weren't quite sure what it was all about, I encourage you to reach out. You can go to my website, robharder.com, or just email me at rob@robharder.com. I would happy to provide a free sample coaching session so you can determine if coaching is for you. All right, thanks again for tuning in. Now back to the show. So I know you've talked to some great guests you've had on the show. Let's talk a little bit more about Dreaming in Color and this podcast you have and the emphasis you're doing to really lift up voices that maybe were not heard before, and they're doing great work. Maybe you can talk more about why it's such a passion for you personally, and what really, I know Darren shared it when he was on the show, but it's been a while. Maybe to share again, what was the purpose of this podcast and really the movement, if you will, and then what have you seen so far from some of your guests? I know you've already referenced a few of them, which is great, but maybe you could talk more about that.
Yeah, so again, the podcast was created in 2022. I think as a part of the trend that we've already touched on a little bit, right? The what was at that point an ongoing civil rights movement, and coupled with that, a real desire to create space for Black social change, social sector leaders to share their insights, their expertise, their experience, and to not just connect with folks in terms of the work, but to develop a personal connection. And so when Darren Isom created the podcast, it was with the intent of creating candid kitchen table conversations that would allow listeners to effectively sit down with these really inspiring folks and hear what's on their mind and hear how they've gotten to where they are and how they imagine the future. And so when Darren approached Anum and myself about hosting this season, we wanted to focus on reimagining our work as a theme. Because I think we're in a moment in time right now where a lot of folks are looking for leadership, and a lot of folks are perhaps feeling like they're not seeing it, or they're struggling to find it. And the reality is that it's there, but we need to create opportunities for folks to find the leaders that are speaking to them.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Anum, what have your experience been so far, and why are you so passionate about this?
Yeah, I think just building off of that piece that Christian named, of folks are like looking for leaders and some stars and lights to follow, both in this moment in time, but more generally. I think one thing I've been like reflecting on is just how much we can learn from both the folks who've come before us, but also just all of the ideas and ambitions and perspectives that younger leaders also have. I was particularly struck by Rhea Baker, one of our guests, who's a writer and an activist. She talked a lot about how this work really takes all of us, and how do we, with a lens of love, really be able to see others and recognize that us working together helps both of us and all of us. And I think especially in this like political moment, there's a ton of polarization, divisiveness, you name it. I think there's just a lot of that, and seeing even just how the next generation is also leading on that front that we can learn from.
Yeah, well said. And you both have really referenced this. There's no doubt, I'd say definitely since what really started around 2020, 2021, there's been this movement, right? And it really translated into a big push for more diversity on nonprofit staff, let alone just across the board in every sector, right? And a lot of people call it the DEI, move of really trying to create more DEI throughout all organizations. And now you're starting to see states, entities almost have a reaction against that and remove those things, these requirements for DEI. Tell me more of your thoughts on that. What's your reflections on that? What do you think is going on? What maybe with some of your guests that's been on the show, what's their perspective of this? It's almost like there's this big push, right? Now there's this big reaction. We're somewhere in between. And you mentioned we are polarized as a nation. It seems like more and more, but I'm just curious about that specifically. What are you seeing on your end, and just what's your perspective on this?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I'll name, and just even, again, speaking with leaders, I feel like you draw so much inspiration from others. And one person had noted, like, this isn't the first time that there's been an anti-rights movement. And it didn't just start after 2020, 21, 22. Rather, there's been pieces of that have always been at play, and folks actually who have been in this work for a long time. And so I find a lot of power even in just like recognizing that and knowing that there are a lot of shoulders to also build off of, or to lean on. One of the pieces, I've recently coming off of some work helping a cohort of organizations develop racial equity plans. And a big part of those conversations was like, how do we respond in this moment? And one of the pieces that was common across many organizations was getting really clear on the why. Like, why does racial equity matter for our organization? And for most organizations, it was some version of, we cannot actually have the impact that we want if we don't consider race and the impacts of structural racism. It's not about, we're being selective or deprioritizing others. Rather, it's like we actually just can't do that work properly. And in every system, from veterans work to education to health, like that the racial inequities are there. And without recognizing those, we actually can't live into the missions that we seek. But having that shared alignment on like, well, why does this actually matter? And both aligning our staff along on that vision, I think has just been really important, and we've seemed to be valuable for at least the organizations I've had the opportunity to work with.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay, Christian, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think Anum said it well. I would start by echoing the first part of what you said, Anum, just in that this is not new, right? This is a centuries old back and forth, and I believe that we are moving forward along that arc, right? And I think that one thing that a lot of organizations are really starting to understand since 2020, 2021 is the idea that having a strategy for equity or inclusivity is not a subcomponent of your organizational strategy. It's embedded in every part of your organizational strategy. And so I think that part of the counter movement takes that for granted with the assumption that they can sort of get at an isolated component of an organization strategy that is DEI. But if everything that an organization does is rooted in understandings of inequity, by not compartmentalizing that work, it's not so easily pushed back because organizations are rooted in it. And so I find a lot of hope in that. And I think that the organizations that I see really doing an incredible job pushing equity forward have really understood that it's not something that can be compartmentalized. It's something that has to be ingrained in the organization itself.
Yeah, who would you say, are there a couple of organizations that you can think of that are really doing a good job on that specifically? Is there any organizations that jump out to you that you feel like are really doing a good job in this space? And then maybe Christian, you can answer first, and then Anum. Yeah.
So most of the work that I do at Bridgespan is in place-based investing, and so I mean, even without naming names, I think that as sort of a portion of the nonprofit sector, I think that place-based organizations set a lot of best practices in that sense, right? Because the work that they do is rooted in community. It's rooted in community prioritization and community needs and community hopes for themselves, right? So it's really about transitioning power, right? It's not investing on behalf of somebody. It's empowering somebody to invest on their own behalf. And I think that that's an example of an approach that can be really rooted in equity because of its intention of sharing, if not transferring power.
Got it. Okay. Anum, what would you say to that?
I'll say, I don't think there's any organization that's gotten this like fully right. Definitely there's a spectrum, but I think some part of the recognition here is that it's kind of an endless journey and just continuous improvement too that it requires. Because the society that we're in is based off of hundreds of years of structures and systems being developed. It's not something that any organization can crack over time or just overnight. And so rather, I think some of the bright spots I've seen are just continuing to do that reflection and learning and understanding. I mentioned earlier this notion of a lot of leaders are facing pushback from staff, et cetera. Part of that is also just like a symptom of that. How do we actually lean into that and continue to reflect and learn on how we can be better? So that's one piece of it. The other is, I think there's just a lot of other like good, healthy organizational practices that also contribute to more inclusive and equitable organizations. So I think about like inclusive decision making. Are you even clear about the roles in an organization, and folks actually understand where they are only providing input or they actually do have decision-making authority, and not in ways that I think are even hierarchical, but to say, actually, as a leader, I don't need to make a decision on this. Actually, I'm going to empower the person below me to make this type of decision. Again, you have some nuance. Not every decision that you can just delegate, but I think even some of that then gets to some of the sharing power, being able to empower others that even Christian was alluding to. So anyway, some of this I do think is just like also effective organizational practices as well.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. Well, as we step back again on broader leadership issues, when it comes to like nonprofit leaders that are really trying to change and improve their own leadership style, their own just leadership, not even their style, just their leadership, from your work with leaders across the spectrum, what would you recommend as one of the key things that leaders should continue to work on, improve on, so they can really truly be better leaders? And Anna, maybe you can start with that and then Christian.
Yeah, I'll just, I guess, go back to what I had said earlier, more at the individual level is doing that self-learning and reflecting along the way. And I think sometimes what is tricky as leaders is oftentimes people are looking to you for the answers.
Right.
When actually sometimes it's okay to not know. And being in that continuous mode of learning can be so helpful, whether it's how do I do better for my staff? How do I do better for the clients that we're trying to serve? Whatever it might be. But I think some of that piece just requires even being open to the learning in the first place.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Christian.
Yeah, I really like that point, Anum. I think that's really important. And I think on a similar note, I think to me, compelling leadership often starts with compelling introspection. And I think that it's a really challenging part of this work because the day-to-day that so many nonprofit leaders go through can be such a sort of a wind tunnel that taking the time to step back and check in can be really challenging. But I really encourage folks listening to take that seriously. I think it's important to really interrogate how you show up in the work as a leader and how your experiences and your privileges inform the way that you occupy space, and then think about how you can leverage those experiences, those assets, those privileges, not just in service of your organization, but of the broader movement that your organization falls into.
Well, hey, thank you so much. I think my listeners will want to find a little bit more about you and also about Dreaming in Color. So where would you send them? What was the best place for them to connect with you, either online, social media, and or find out about Dreaming in Color?
Yeah, I would send them straight to the Bridgespan website. They can find out more about me and Anum there, as well as find links to season 3 of Dreaming in Color and prior seasons as well.
We're also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you find podcasts.
Perfect. Great. Well, Anum, Christian, thank you. Thanks for all you're doing for the nonprofit sector. Thanks for taking time to be on the show, and good luck with season 3 here. And I just always love hearing from people from Bridgespan because, again, you do really good work. You provide us good data. So again, thanks for being on the show and sharing your insights.
It's a pleasure, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rob.
Hey, friends. Well, I wanted you to know that this podcast can be found on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and wherever you listen to other podcasts. I also want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with others. This will actually help us get this great content out to more nonprofit leaders just like you. You can also join the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast community. Find other resources and interviews of past guests all on my website, nonprofitleadershippodcast.org. Well, thanks again for listening. And until next time, keep making your world better. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Go to YouTube and look up Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. We'll see you there. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business.